you'd see people at 1 a.m. just like huge groups of people partying, fighting. You'd see spikes in violence on a monthly cadence. And I remember talking to someone say, hey, why is everyone out today? It's like, well, the EBT money hit. And so when you have an infusion of cash into these communities, for example, you can even just see the social patterns, arrests, violence, et cetera. And then you kind of start to understand, okay, money alone is not the solution. It has to be obviously resources, money that is, I think, earned. And then also that is in the context of a culture that has a set of values that can hold it together. And look, all over, and I think especially in the United States, that cultural net has really been shredded, and it cannot be solved like the way we've been doing it since 1964, 65, really the late 1960s by the time it got off the ground. The war on poverty, spending trillions of dollars now, has not solved it. I think, if anything, what I've observed in studying the historical record and then studying it empirically, looking at it face to face, poverty is much worse now, even though you have a higher median income. And so we have this paradox where we have actual material wealth. Poor people in the United States are richer than almost every other group globally. And yet the experience is much worse. And I think that in my travels abroad, it's like, almost if you have to choose from a cultural standpoint, would you rather be poor in maybe a developing country, buffeted from some of these things, or poor in the United States, which in many cases it's like a hellscape, violence, addiction, mental illness, kind of shredded social net. And these aren't easy questions, and they certainly don't have easy answers.
Well, the part of the appalling hypersimplicity of the woke moralist claim is that poverty is reducible to lack of money. And in fact, true poverty is a multidimensional problem. And the multidimensional problem is essentially something like lack of proper placement within a functioning social hierarchy and lack of forward vision. And then what happens if people don't have anything they regard as useful, productive, and generous to do that they're committed to, then what happens is, because they can't find meaning or surcease from anxiety in the pursuit of a well-constituted life, they default to impulsive pleasure seeking. And then if you add money into that situation, it makes it worse, because there's nothing that facilitates impulsive pleasure seeking than money, like money, right? And so it's definitely the case that, well, it's a hell of a good time for 4 or 5 days in the bar. And I'm not saying that poor people drink more, although I am saying that people who drink more and act in that impulsive manner are far more likely to be poor. And so there's also bidirectional causality constantly at work in a manner that, this is also what makes me, a manner that belies the leftist claims. This is also one of the things that makes me very skeptical about the moral certainty that the leftists, who are hypothetically on the side of the poor, bring to the table with regard to arguments all the time. It's like, well, this unidimensional sympathy you have, and this insistence that all of this complex problem can be reduced to, let's say, the greed of the capitalist overlords, might do wonders for you and your ego, allowing you to parade as, this year's incarnation of the spirit of Che Guevara, who is a murderous punk, by the way. But it does nothing for the people who you are attempting to hypothetically help, except make their lives a hell of a lot more miserable. But you get to feel good about it, so that's a small price to pay, all things considered. All right, so that all broke for you when you were working for NPR.
Yeah.
You started to see. So now, did you actually start moving in more, say, classic liberal or conservative circles at that point? I mean, you must kind of been at a loss for a while, given that your worldview had come under assault under the brutal lessons of reality.
Yeah, exactly. And these are documentaries for PBS, and I was kind of moving to the center, moving to the right. I went through kind of a libertarian phase, even to my own embarrassment now. And my politics shifted, and I could just feel it, that my relationships with colleagues were starting to fray. People were whispering, I think Rufo's maybe a conservative now, very concerned about me. And then there was a kind of moment where I had to make a decision. Am I going to engage in politics? Am I going to say what I think is true? Am I going to face the consequences? And, ultimately I said, look, I was kind of turning 30 and I said, it's either now or never. I'm going to kind of come out. I'm going to stake my claim. I burned all of my relationships in the documentary world. I lost funders. I had people who had worked for me as contractors for years tell me that they couldn't work with me anymore. And so the documentary world was just a total dead end. I mean,
that was when? What year was that?
Oh, this was probably like 2015, 2016 when it started to change. So right at the kind of the Trump years.
Nobody can shun like what would you call it? A burned leftist. I mean, look, I've tried to maintain a relatively balanced view of the excesses on both sides of the political spectrum. But one thing I have clearly experienced repeatedly is that the left will shun and exclude to a degree that's almost unknown on the right. I've never had anyone on the right that I've talked to refuse to talk to a hypothetical guest, for example. And I've had people on the left, they just do that all the time. And I don't get that exactly. I think maybe it has to do with the association in personality between agreeableness and leftist proclivity. So the socialist types, the lefties, are technically more agreeable. And I think maybe among agreeable people, if you don't go along with the agreeable game, you're much more likely to be categorized as a predator.
And I think it's also partly an institutional question. So something like PBS, something like the art world, something like the cultural world, certainly also the academic world, these are artificial economies, right? They're propped up by the state. They're propped up by philanthropic funding. There are a limited number of spots. It's highly competitive. It's a lot of people that are very credentialed, very intelligent, and they have to find strategies to fight it out for these limited resources. They see them as zero-sum games. Whereas in corporations or entrepreneurship, which are traditionally more kind of conservative or free market, the idea is, well, we can create a company with 2 people and grow it to 100,000 people. There's a sense of expansion. There's a sense of possibility.
Okay, well, that's a good theory. So you think if you view what you're doing as a zero-sum game, there's always a rationale for exclusion.
Of course, yeah, and you're trying to move up a hierarchy, and it's not competence that's rewarded, it's not economic productivity that's rewarded. In all of these places, it's not even really an economic question anymore. And so you can critique Marx. I think that's good and fine and true. But the real change on the left, and I think this plays into both what we were talking about previously and this question, is that they've moved from a unit of analysis or a basis of analysis of economics, a material basis, to a